Hello, everyone, and yes, welcome to the conference. So nice to see so many people here after such a long while of preparing for this conference. And last year we couldn't do this large conference, so we had a smaller symposium. And as a result of that, we are now advancing here with a bigger conference and hope to have similar meetings also in the future with all of you. So maybe I could already start now presenting Andrea. We are 9 minutes before schedule, but yeah, Andréa Zhouri is Professor of Anthropology at the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. And she's really a leading scholar on the Brazilian environmental issues and problems and conflicts, resistance movements, the study of violence. She has a degree from in anthropology from the University of Campinas, and then a PhD in sociology from Essex University, and where she studied in her PhD the role of British campaigners regarding the Brazilian Amazon. And since the 90s, she has been studying large projects in local communities, and especially since the mining disaster of Samarco in Rio Doce in 2015, which created a large tsunami of mud. She has been studying the effects of those disasters for local communities, as well as the governance of that disaster. And she's also an expert on mining conflicts, leading a large group of scholars studying the mining projects and their conflicts in the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil and also elsewhere. And very familiar with the discussions about mining and extractivism in Latin America, with many publications on these issues in Portuguese, English, and other languages. And yeah, we will have some time now for Andrea's presentation, and after that we will have time for discussion. And if you have any questions, please feel free to add the questions to the Q&A. Yes, maybe I can introduce myself still. So I'm Markus Kröger, Associate Professor of Global Development Studies and also an Academy of Finland Research Fellow, currently studying the political economies of deforestation in Brazil, Peru, and Finland. Yes, so maybe should we start now with Andrea? Sophia, I'll still wait 7 minutes, or is it okay to start already now?
It'll be okay to start now. I mean, this is maybe the first time in history a conference has run early, so we might as well lean into this moment. So yes, Andrea, if you would like to come on screen now, and hopefully we'll have a nice smooth transition with the screen sharing, but just give a yell if you run into any problems.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. I'm very honored to join you at this EXALT conference after so long expectations about it and preparations about it. I'm very thrilled, and I'd like to thank Barry Gills, Markus Kröger, Sofia Agaloni-Albov for inviting me and for putting all this together. Really amazing. Considering the overall panel already presented by Barry Gills, our challenges now of the present and for the future, my conference today will reflect on how global extractivism aligned with liberal environmentalism have paved the way for anti-environmental and anti-indigenous positions in the center of power in Brazil today. And I have prepared a few slides to help us go through this. So let me see if I can share my screen with you. Okay. Oh, right. I think I have to minimize this, right?
It looks beautiful. We can see it perfectly.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Sophia, for helping me with this. Well, in the last couple of years, international media coverage on deforestation and fires in the Amazon alongside protests of indigenous peoples in Brazil have made me travel back in time, back to the 1980s, when the apocalyptic images of the burning Amazon caught up the world's attention, as you can see in this cover page of the Time magazine from 1989. A world that also listened to the testimonies of Chico Mendes, José Lutzenberger, Chief Raoni, and even Sting, among so many others involved in the fight to save the Amazon. The 1980s became known as the decade of destruction and was thus framed in a series of filmed by Adrian Cowell and Vicente Rios. You can find these films in the internet, I believe. At that time, social environmentalism emerged in Brazil, marked by the experiences of the Alliance of Forest Peoples, an articulation that brought together the struggle of the rubber tappers of Acre, the indigenous movement, and the resistance to large hydroelectric dams in the Amazon. Indigenous resistance against Belo Monte Dam has produced iconic images such that of Tuira with her machete raised against the president of Eletronorte at a public hearing in 1989, or like that of young Ailton Krenak, who wearing a white suit and his face painted with Jenny Papo, defended the rights of indigenous peoples during a session of the National Congress in 1987. Not surprisingly, these are images evoked today to the extent that anti-environmental and anti-indigenous discourses and practice seem to emerge from a pre-Rio summit context. So the current Brazilian political context activates my memories of youth in a double movement. On the one hand, recalling the destructive forces of the past that seem to prowl the present, and on the other, evoking the resistance that brought together counter-hegemonic forces in defense of the environment, the Amazon, and indigenous peoples. When the fragile ideological edifice of the consensus on sustainable development seems to be collapsing after 4 decades of insistent construction, it is important to recall the history of struggles that have bequeathed us with processes of environmentalization of society and the state, whether at the level of scientific knowledge and the organization of society, or at the level of institutional and normative dimensions, as in the chapters of the federal constitution concerned with the environment and indigenous rights in Brazil. Indeed, Article 231 of the 1988 Constitution reads, "It is recognized to indigenous peoples their social organization, their customs, language, beliefs, and traditions, and the regional rights over lands they traditionally occupy belonging to the union," that is the state, "to demarcate them, to protect and enforce respect for all their assets." As in the chapter on the environment, chapter 6, article 225, everyone has the right to an ecologically balanced environment, a good for the common use of the people and essential to a healthy quality of life, imposing on the public power and the collectivity the duty to defend it and preserve it for present and future generations. There's also a special paragraph on the Brazilian Amazon, the Pantanal, the Atlantic forest, and other important ecosystems in the country. So therefore, it is equally relevant to reflect, analyze the risks and limits of such environmentalization, especially with regard to the suppression of dissent around environmental and territorial conflicts, which are recalcitrant over the years, configuring, in the sense of Herring V, a chronic crisis in the Brazilian society. In fact, anti-environmental and anti-indigenous positions are constitutive of Brazilian history, although the presence in the government today is felt in a rather programmatic way. Jair Bolsonaro won the 2018 election with clear messages against indigenous peoples and the environment. But I believe the majority of the Brazilian people were astonished by the statements made by the former Minister of the Environment, Ricardo Salles, who at the ministerial meeting of April 2020 openly suggested, and I quote, to take advantage of the crisis of the pandemic to speed up changes in environmental rules with ordinary measures, decrees, among other tricks. He used the expression passar a boiada, which is very difficult to translate into English, but it means like opening the doors, run the cattle herd. Yeah. At the same ministerial meeting, the Minister of Education also made open his, I quote, hatred for the expression indigenous peoples. He repeated the word hate 3 times without causing any reaction from the other ministers at the same meeting. Both ministers already stepped down, but the political positions they represent remains in office. So, how have we arrived at this current scenario where statements and initiatives against the environment and indigenous peoples are placed in daylight by those in charge of these issues? I'd like to develop my argument in 2 parts. Firstly, by identifying some of the domestic roots of anti-environmental and anti-indigenous discourses, especially among the military and regional oligarchies. And secondly, by analyzing in a more global scale how liberal environmentalism of sustainable development, paved the way for the rise of anti-environmentalism. So I begin with the first part, the roots of anti-environment and anti-indigenous discourses. In the early 1990s, anti-environmental positions were voiced by the military and regional politicians while the country was going through a growing debate on sustainable development. The anti-environmental discourses seemed therefore anachronistic in the face of the changes in the world. These changes were well represented by the end of the Cold War, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and other economic and cultural frontiers, which together with technological innovations in communication, increased the imagination of the world as a single global space. In this context, a global event such as the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, the Earth Summit, held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, was perceived by the military and local politicians as a major international conspiracy to occupy the Amazon. There was then a marriage, so to speak, between the military concern with national sovereignty, which implied the territorial control of the Amazon, and the interests of the rural oligarchy and multinational corporations, which intended to appropriate Amazonia for capitalist accumulation. Accusations against environmentalists were well registered by the press. The military accused environmentalists of being internationalist and non-patriotic, enemies of the nation, while environmentalists responded by holding the military responsible for international economic investments in the Amazon since the 1970s, when Brazil was a dictatorship. Former Army Secretary Leonidas Pires stated, for instance, that he felt for José Lutzenberger, the environmental secretary at the time, there was no Minister of Environment, but National Secretary of Environment, the same, he said, he felt the same hate he felt for communist leader Luiz Carlos Prestes. The comparison between José Lutzenberger, a well-known Brazilian environmentalist who played an important role in denouncing and stopping the World Bank's projects in the Amazon in the late 1980s, and Luiz Carlos Prestes, the head of the Communist Party in Brazil for many decades, exemplifies how environmentalists gradually replaced communists as enemies of the nation in the eyes of the military between the late 1980s and early 1990s. At a symposium held in October 1991, just before the Rio Summit, 2 national army bodies, ESEMI and SEBRE, produced a document aimed at raising public awareness about the Earth, the Earth Summit. In geopolitical terms, the document identifies both internal and external enemies around the issue of the environment. As Gilberto Mestrinho, governor of the state of Amazonas at the time, points out, There is an industry of mystification making us believe that we cannot cut down the trees because of the fragility of the Amazon ecosystem. Why do they spread such myths? Because it comprises the biggest mineral area in the world. Hence, immediately in the second half of the 60s and strongly in the 70s, Brazil was invaded by a campaign for the preservation of the Amazon. Exactly for what purpose? Because the rich mineral resources of the Amazon compete with the investments that developed countries have in other parts of the world. On the indigenous question, the same document sums up the position of the military. Zhouri says, Zhouri is against the radical preservation of the Aboriginal culture and the formation of cysts in areas not proportionally related to the number of silvicolas. And I call attention here to the word cysts, like a cancer within the national organism, something like that. And the word silvicolas, something that relates to an inhabitant of the jungle. A category that really empties any sense of social and cultural existence for these groups. No? In 1993, there was a Yanomami massacre in the borders with Venezuela. Asked about his belief in the internationalization of the Amazon thesis, the army minister at the time, Zenildo Lucena, stated, "This is our concern. The wealth of the Amazon leads us to these concerns. There is a great interest in the area. It is the largest mineral reserve in the world, as the permanent presence of miners indicates. The question of the Yanomami nation is very dangerous. The nation is the Brazilian one. We need to be cautious. There is the case of Bosnia to prove it." There are conflicts in Bosnia at the time. So we perceive here how the word nation raises concerns about the rise of separatist movements within Brazil. Moving on to the following decade, in 2001, under the rule of the so-called Social Democrats, Fernando Henrique Cardoso's government, a series of reports revealed the existence of a military headquarters in Marabá in the south of Pará. Secret army documents disclosed to the public spying practices thought to be extinguished with the end of the military dictatorship. Social movements, unions, political parties, and NGOs were classified in these documents as adverse forces. To defeat these forces, the military assumed possible, and I quote, infringements of rights. Later on, in 2008, already under the Workers' Party administration, Lula's government, public debate escalated again due to the conflicts between farmers and indigenous peoples of the Raposa Serra do Sol Reserve on the border with Venezuela. After a struggle that lasted for about 3 decades, the Raposa Serra do Sol indigenous land was established, despite protests from landowners and politicians in the region. Rice producers who arrived in Roraima through colonization programs implemented by the federal government, together with the military and other political elites, never accepted this land demarcation. The 2008 debate on indigenous lands occurs in the same terms as in the 1990s, For instance, the headline of a weekly magazine called Isto É, Revista Isto É, stated, "The Amazon, its sovereignty is in question. Proposals for the internationalization of Brazil's greatest green treasure gain momentum in the global community. An immediate answer is necessary." This is from May 2008. Again, the use of the word nation as a reference to indigenous groups and identities is severely criticized, as in the following comments also from journalist Arnaldo Jabor in a leading television news show, Jornal Nacional from Global TV. Jabor states, "Are there indigenous nations other than the Brazilian nation? There is malicious madness in the country dividing us into various nations, Indian, Black, non-Brazilian. This favors the swindling NGOs, both international and national, who profit from the division in terms of money and control. So anti-environment and anti-indigenous discourses evokes threats to national sovereignty, equating for this purpose the dimensions of geographic space, territory, and nation in opposition to ethnic cultural plurality. It is a project of nation-state averse to difference and diversity. Nationalist when it comes to issues such as environmental and indigenous rights, but internationalist when related to economic exploitation of natural resources. I have selected these excerpts to show, in a way, the historic balance of anti-environment and anti-indigenous positions in our society since the 1980s and 1990s, when the country's re-democratization coincided with globalization processes such as the growing debate on sustainable development. However, if on the one hand, the identification of the roots of these anti-environment and anti-indigenous positions in conservative segments of the Brazilian society help us to understand the discourses brought to light today by actors socialized in the same institutions, like President Jair Bolsonaro himself, a former army person. On the other hand, the concreteness of these anti-environment positions must also be understood in a wider context, that of neoliberal and neo-development policies that, by embracing a certain global environmental perspective, that of ecological modernization, paved the way for today's environmental deregulation and institutional dismantling. Therefore, my analysis shall turn now to some of these aspects. So I begin now the second part of my presentation, from slow violence to raw violence, how liberal environmentalism of sustainable development paved the way for the rise of anti-environmentalism. I identify the current policies of environmental dismantling as a kind of raw violence, as opposed to a previous political period marked by neo-developmentalism, in which environmental deregulation was gradually conducted in a less spectacular way, in a kind of slow violence, a term I borrow from Rob Nixon. Under slow violence, especially since the 1990s, the country has gradually postponed the demarcation of indigenous territories and traditional communities' lands in the same proportion that, in the same pace, it has opened new territories for the advance of soybeans, sugarcane, eucalyptus plantations, and large-scale mining, among other types of commodities. We have witnessed the increase of conflict in environmental protection areas, while infrastructure projects such as large dams and large-scale mining have their environmental impact assessment granted with high numbers of conditionalities, mitigating and compensating measures never usually met. All of this operating within the good governance global regime and the democratic rule of law in Brazil under the so-called progressive government. This is how, in my view, the slow violence paved the way for the rise of anti-environmentalism, a position once restricted to a few lobbies in parliament, and that now stands at the heart of state power. And how this became to be. Back to the 1990s, two global environmental regimes somehow merge, one subsuming the other. The Rio Summit in 1992 may represent the sustainable development regime, whereas the creation of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 1993 seals the Washington Consensus in the economic agenda. Gradually, the WTO regime encapsulated the environment agenda already well managed by the World Bank at the time, with its conditionalities for loans to developing countries. Sustainable development became a mantra central to the idea of good governance. It represented, in fact, a compromise between capital and environmental critique, making possible the apparent consensus between the two agendas, the environment on the one hand and the liberal economic on the other. Environment management became central to the idea of sustainable development and its ecological modernization paradigm. This paradigm was built around market solutions, technical efficiency, and political consensus. Therefore, emphasis was given to the so-called participation principle, such as stakeholder process, public hearings, and environment impact assessments, and so on. Nevertheless, the management approach underlined an agenda of initiatives that proved to be focused on techniques and procedures than on political purposes or in projects for social change and environmental justice, for example. In contrast to this liberal environmentalism embraced by corporations, state, and hegemonic NGOs, environmental justice movements raises the issues of environmental inequality, environmental racism, leading a diverse range of proposals for social environmental changes. Several movements have joined the resistance of those directly affected by deforestation and large dams projects in Amazonia and other parts of the country. Alliances were made between environmentalists, indigenous and traditional peoples organizations. However, political efforts to build a vigorous consensus through participation principles confused the direction of the critique at first, especially during the 1990s. It became increasingly evident that participation, the democratic principle under ecological modernization, presented itself, in fact, as a late and tricky process. For instance, in the context of environment impact assessment, participation is limited to the debate about compensation and mitigation of the effects of large projects, that is, to the environmental unfoldings of such projects called externalities, as Barry Gills have already pointed in his opening words. There's little space for participation about territorial planning, for example. This is something that should precede environment impact assessment. Participation, as I have bear witness, is usually disciplined by subtle mechanisms of negotiation and production of acceptance, a pacification of dissent, or domestication of socio-environmental conflicts, a sort of coercive harmony, to put it in Laura Nader's terms. Strategies for involving local people in these alleged democratic initiatives is filled with manipulation and cooptation. Locals are rarely represented by the most critical voices on the ground. Even researchers and well-intended academics may find support within such initiatives, often financed by World Bank and other think tankers. However, the agenda of social environmental movements comprising principles of equity and environmental justice, dimensions that require, among others, the debate on land tenure, territorial distribution, and destination, remained absent from this hegemonic environmental agenda. Although similarly participative, there has been an increase in slow violence. Symbolic violence is aligned to material violence as the loosening of regulatory norms and procedures, along with pre-existing inefficiency in law enforcement, frequently open up space for insidious actions to emerge. Forced displacement and displacements in situ often go hand in hand with human rights violations, including the right to such things as information, potable water, freedom of movement, and so on, as it has happened in many mining areas in Minas Gerais, where I am located and where I have my field work more recently. But even within this context, liberal environmentalism and its technical solutions based on capital, bureaucracy, and science, built in a complex way to theoretically overcome environmental decline, has generated a high social and financial cost for investors and business elites. Motivated or justified by successive economic crises, the international capital has invested in building up a consensus around the so-called flexibilization, the loosening of environmental procedures, such as the environment impact assessment. Since 2004, for example, we have seen the emergence in Brazil of a set of initiatives promoted by business groups, strongly articulated with representatives of the parliament, which ended up by proposing a constitutional amendment to change the overall rule for environment impact assessment. Environment impact assessment has been pointed out as one of the main villains of the country's economic growth, the main barrier to development. A study conducted by the World Bank in 2008 appears as the spearhead of the escalating debate for deregulation in Brazil. The deregulation movement is in full swing, with an agenda of proposals for the systematic revision of numerous other laws and norms created even previously to the 1988 Constitution, such as the Forest Code, the Mining Code, the Water Code, and many others involving the interests of agribusiness and mining corporations. All of these taking place under the worldwide ideology of good governance and within the democratic rule of law, which maintain active the principle of participation in the form of a wide range of social concepts, most of them extinguished or reduced now through raw violence. That is, more than 600 organs of popular participation were extinguished or reduced by Jair Bolsonaro in 2019. From March to May 2020, during the pandemic, the federal government edited 195 acts related to the environment against 16 acts issued in 2019, for example, in the same period. Besides, the military have replaced technical personnel in the management of different environmental bodies in several levels. So the context today is one of violence without disguises. And my argument is that the utopia centered on the so-called win-win solutions, which marked previous governments, paved the way for open anti-environmentalism, which is also racist in many ways. This is noticeable not only in deregulation policy, but also in the dismantling of state institutions. The number of indigenous leaders killed in 2019 was the highest in 11 years. Of the 18 people murdered in land conflicts in 2020, 7 were indigenous. The vulnerability of indigenous peoples to COVID is alarming. In 2020, the deforestation rate in the legal Amazon accuses an increase of 9.5% in relation to 2019, a year in which the rate already broke records. A total of 1,110,000 hectares of forests were cleared out. Meanwhile, government representatives speak about the elimination of activism and name environmental institutions such as IBAMA and ICMBio as factories of fines, accusations that apart from causing a drastic budgetary drop in these bodies, have fostered an environment of disrespect for the environmental laws, to enforcement of laws, implying a reduction in environmental enforcement and inspections, intensification of deforestation, an increase in invasions of traditionally occupied lands, and the worsening of armed conflicts, the escalating of armed conflicts in the Amazon and other rural areas. In this scenario, the pressure to regulate mining, oil and gas production and energy generation on indigenous land is intensifying. Several bills have been submitted to Congress, such as Draft Law 490, a law that changed all the rules for the demarcation of indigenous lands, Bill 919, that intends to rule mining in the indigenous lands, and Bill 2633, providing for the 10-year regulation of occupations occurring on lands of the state, public land. All these, in fact, tempting at the commodification of indigenous lands and forests. Meanwhile, the good governance believers are still committed to Green New Deal initiatives, building up certification schemes, for instance, devoted to promote the so-called sustainable dams or responsible mining as initiative within ICMM. To conclude, policies that slide between deregulation and environmental dismantling make us wonder about the possible reshaping of the state, Brazilian state at present. The raw violence of today increases the ecological debt, deepens the gap of environmental injustice, and threatens the constitutional rights. But it also clashes with global liberal environmentalism, which since the 1990s has developed disciplinary vices as subtle forms of domination. So I close with a few last questions. I have only questions really. What would raw violence be sustainable for business in a world where values such as modernity, civilization, and democracy still prevail? Was it not precisely in the name of democracy and modernity that slow violence was instituted through the peacemaking process of dissent? To what extent will these values dear to the Western system of domination be discharged and replaced by others sustaining a more brutal strand of world liberalism? What would be the social and legal basis for its legitimacy and legality? More concretely, could a Green New Deal really stop climate change and promote social justice or environmental justice? Or will it rather foster sustainable colonialism over the territories of traditional peoples which already have a better record in climate issues anyway? These are questions that, in my view, challenge us all in respect to concurrent crises today and the possible futures. These are issues to which many social environmental movements and local communities have engaged with, not only in their daily struggle to survive, but also in their vision of the future and of a better world. River, forests, and savanna dwellers point to the construction of a collective model of self-determination, which is emancipatory and decolonialized, based on a diverse range of cosmologies and singular relationship with nature. As researchers, academics, and scientists ourselves, perhaps we have much to gain by engaging ourselves with such movements, theories, ideas, and co-construction of knowledge. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you for this presentation, Andrea. Would anyone have any comments, questions? Please use the question and answers.
Any questions and answers roll in quite yet, but I'm hoping that Marcus, maybe you would be the first to give a little bit of reflection on the presentation while we allow a few questions to build up. I know that you also have done work in similar areas.
I would like to make some comments here. Yes. So yeah, I know you have done really great work on this issue of so-called stakeholder dialogue, and there was this wonderful photo of the Anglo-American projects. I guess that was the Minas Rio iron ore mining project in Conceição de Mato Dentro, about how the policemen were there ordering the people, and this how there is the usage of violence together with this so-called liberal stakeholder dialogue. So maybe if you could say something more about that process and how it ended and so on, and about this book, based on that book of yours, the ways of formas de matar, these ways of killing, and I think the title of the book.
Yeah. Ways of killing is the ways of practicing slow violence. Huh? What we meant by ways of killing in long term, medium long term, is the ways that regulations were already transformed, slowly transformed in every case in order to make possible the approval, the license, the environmental license for these projects. So Minas Rio is a very interesting case. As you know, it's an Anglo-American project, mining project, a project that starts in Minas Gerais, and with mining in Minas Gerais, and with a transport, a pipeline to transport the iron ore to the Atlantic Ocean, right, through Rio de Janeiro, a port built in Rio de Janeiro. So it's something very big, it's huge, it covers up to more than 500 kilometers in distance, and it goes through more than 30 municipalities and hundreds of local communities. It cuts across all this huge territory. And Anglo-America has had all the permits it needs to operate, and is expanding its operations in Minas Gerais. And the government of the state of Minas Gerais even changed the law radically, even after the huge disaster of Mariana in 2015. As you know, there was this huge disaster, the biggest at the time, and it's biggest in relation to the amount of the volume, no? of sludge, how do you call it, the trash from the mining, right? Sorry, I forgot the word now. But anyway, the release of this was really amazing, more than 50 million tons. And it travels all along the Rio Doce, over 700 kilometers until the Atlantic Ocean too. And despite that, of course, 90 people died immediately, but as a disaster, as you know, people still dying for many reasons, yeah? Because there is no resettlement, there is no still. So even after the rupture of this dam in 2015, the state of Minas Gerais really passed a bill that changed the overall system of permits, environmental permits in Minas, and to make it flexible, to make it easier, to make it speedy for the mining companies. So, which is really a problem for the people, technical people, to analyze the problems and to ask for research and things like that. It's really speeding up the process. And it started in Minas Gerais in 2016, this changings of law, and now it becomes national. The National Congress in Brazil has just approved, voted the bill that changed the overall rule for environmental permits. In May this year, there was this approval, and now the bill is in higher court, the Senate, and they will vote it anytime now. So we have been debating this with the senators, trying to change or to improve or make any inputs to this new law, because previously the impact assessment was made in 3 stages. We have the previous permit, the implementation permit of the process, and the operation permits. Now it's all at once. They tend to do it all at once. And in some cases, even self-regulation. The companies will do the evaluation, and they will just present the paper, as they already do that for mining monitoring, as it happens in Brumadinho, the second hugest disaster recently in Brazil in 2019. Vale had already managed their reports and presented reports saying that the dam was safe, things like that, self-monitoring. So these are ways of killing. The ways of killing, which we try to discuss in 2014 already. 2014, ways of killing was was the process of slow violence, which I'm talking about now with the dialogue with Rob Nixon, of course, applying here to the situation in Brazil, bringing it to this context in Brazil in a different way. But this is slow violence in the changes in laws, changes in regulation in every case, losing up the regulation. And now with Bolsonaro, the process has actually turned into raw violence, because they don't need to do that schemes anymore. They are changing the whole thing at once. And they are really destroying the institutions from within. They're not only changing the law, but they are really destroying the regulation bodies from within. So it's really, this is the scenario.
We now have a few questions coming from the chat. Do you think now would be a perfect time to maybe take some of those? Yeah, I see a nodding head from Markus. There is also one raised hand from Dominika Glokonsky. We don't take questions directly with video, so maybe Dominika, if you want to ask the question in the chat while we take these questions that came first. So the first question came from Anja Nygren, who asked, what would you suggest could be the paths for transformative alternatives in the contemporary context of Brazil? And then Maria Enström Fuentes asked, do you feel that the concept of sustainability can be used to discuss indigenous ways of solving the climate crisis in the Amazonas, considering that sustainability has such an intrinsic connection to the slow violence and stakeholder dialogues that you described so nicely, with a follow-up coming from Maria on how to overcome these empty promises of stakeholder dialogues and the win-win ideology without residing to the kind of raw violence that you also describe, and what kind of political movement can you put what kind of political movement can put an end to the destruction of the web of life in the Amazon and beyond, which kind of connects to Anja's question as well. So if you maybe start with these two and let's continue later.
Yes, thank you very much for the questions and the interaction. So as for Anja's question on what would be the pathways out of this, is it the question? As far as I understood, yeah, what would be the paths for changes and transformations? I think that there are a lot of social movements and indigenous movements organizing themselves at the moment, yeah. So they are trying to defend their rights first. I think now they are involved in a twofold movement. I think, on the one hand, making sure that no rights are taken away from them, the constitutional rights, the rights already established by the Constitution and other laws in Brazil. So it's a kind of a survival way of no rights be taken away from us, as we say. So they are really vigilant, and they are really occupying the streets, and they are protesting, and they are making lobbies in different ways. And on the other hand, there is this challenge of moving forward and presenting new perspectives, that because they have different visions of how they want the future. Yeah? And I don't think, as to add up with this, with Maria Fuentes' question on sustainability, I don't think sustainability has been a word that has been articulated by these groups, because part of the decolonizing process is to think in terms of categories and systems of thought that come from experiences other than the Western mode of thinking, Western science and Western mode. So they don't deny the Western systems of thinking, but they are now several groups they are regaining control over of the system of knowledge production of their own ancestors and other groups that they interact with. So this is not only in Brazil, but this movement has been happening in the whole Latin America. Gabriela Melinsky, a sociologist from Argentina, has spoken about a new cycle of conflictivity in Latin America, and she points to several movements and aspects related to the new cycle of conflictivity in Latin America, which places the territory, the defense of the territory in the center of the political agenda, the feminist view. It's an eco-feminist approach towards the environment and the political agenda as well. So there are multiple initiatives and movements coming from different indigenous and local communities, and what they articulate in terms of vocabulary of an political agenda. They don't speak of sustainability, but they speak about buen viver, the buen viver, which is, it's difficult to translate. It's not a good life, but what a good life would be, the buen vivir system, and Pachamama. And I think that buen vivir perhaps would be the counterpoint for the idea of sustainability, which is sustainability means that it's still a concept built within the major economic trends in the Western society, within capitalism. So what they try to do is to rescue different systems and different concepts coming from their localities, their ancestors, and I think that the paths out would be, I think that the biggest challenge is for us Westerns, academics and activists, to engage with these concepts and these systems of knowledge produced by the southern groups, these indigenous groups, local groups, in order to build alternatives. Because I think there's no one alternative, there are many alternatives. I think that the first thing they want is the right to say what kind of place they want to live in, the right to decide about the destiny of their territories. They want to have a say. I think the major thing has to do with the authoritarian stand on these ways that the extractivist industry has been imposed itself within these territories. So I think it's a problem of really making space for these people to be heard of. Yeah, that's the problem. Participation is a problem. Participation is too contaminated with the idea that there is a stakeholder process. So we make a consultation, very standard consultation process, and then people are really manipulated in order to fulfill this kind of bureaucratic idea of participation. So I don't know if I really responded to your issues, but these are open for us to see. I think the main thing is really to question our own categories, which are too contaminated by ideas related and dependent on the major hegemonic economic process in the world. I'm very worried nowadays with the idea of responsible mining and sustainable dams, responsible mining, and I know that these are initiatives of miners, of companies, corporations internationally, and I think it's a new round on the debate about sustainable capital. How can we sustain capitalism in the long run by renewing a way of proceeding with these ideas? Is it no? So perhaps you could really reflect critically in the idea of responsible mining. Is it possible to have responsible mining? What does it mean, responsible mining? No? Is it possible to have responsible mining and also sustainable dam construction in the Amazon?
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Andrea. We have 5 other questions, so maybe there's Eva Holtbeckers asking, what could we learn in Finland or north of Europe from the developments in Brazil? I can see several points, but would like to hear your suggestions. Maybe we take these first, and then we have 2 about the Brazilian context.
I don't know. I know we are very anxious to find ways out of these huge crises and several crises we have find ourselves in at the moment. But I think that we are doing it here right now. That the purpose of this conference is to reflect on critical issues. And what I say is that politically, social groups, social movements, the changes are immersed, are embedded in society. So the ways out from this crisis, it's a political issue. It's not a technical or scientific issue. It's not for me, Andréa, social scientist, to point out ways out for the future. I think this is something that political groups, how can I say it? Oh my God, sorry. It's too early here, people. It's 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning. I need to have my thoughts and my English connected together. It's a bit of a trick here. But anyway, I think that ways out to think about futures. We all need to think about futures. And of course, as scientists and researchers, we are worried about our futures. But I think the solutions, let's say, the solutions or the pathways to these futures, this will come from social groups immersed and engaged in processes, political process in society. So for us, we need to engage with these groups. We need to find ourselves within these movements and see what kind of contribution we can give. But I don't believe the solutions will come from academia or from science. Or science is very important in this way. I'm not denying science, please. I'm not denying science. But what I'm saying is that we need to be tuned in. We need to be engaged to what people in these localities are saying, what they're doing, what they're saying. And we need to reveal, to rethink our concepts and our categories, because we are too much dominated by Western systems of thinking. Sustainability, development and sustainability is something that is driving us through this debate for 4 decades. We have been involved in discussing sustainable development, but this discussion has brought us to this dead end here. So we need to really attack it, to see that it's, it's limited. It's limited. It doesn't really help us out. Yeah. So this is a provocation, really. So it's for us to really, I think that in terms of the construction of knowledge, it's really something that's very epistemic. We need to make a move, epistemical move, in order to free ourselves and free our thoughts from the restraints of very strong categories of thought that really make us move in a circle, but not out of the circle, but in the same circle.
Thank you. So then there are 2 questions about the Brazilian politics. So Bon Huego asks, in the Brazilian context, what's the viability of ecological justice movements to become an electoral force against authoritarian populism? And then related to this, Juan Martinez Alier asks, do you think that the next time the left, Lula, the PT, the PSOL, perhaps, if they win the presidency, will be more pro-ecology than last time? Can the anti-extractivist movement the environmental justice movements, the ecofeminist indigenous movements grow and take over the traditional political left?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Martinez Allier and others. Social justice movements in Brazil, they have been growing, they have been strong in the society, but of course, in terms of major politics, in major vertical politics, the input is still very slow and very limited, unfortunately. I don't know really, Ali, I don't know really what will happen when if Lula wins the election. We all hope that he will win the election, because the whole thing today is to really get away from Bolsonaro, get free from Bolsonaro and his gang, because it's really something very strange connected. Not only, some people call him ultra-liberal or proto-fascist, but I don't think these categories are really strong enough or proper to really classify what's going on, because there is a very weird connection between the illicit or political and non-political, but criminal forces within Brazil, criminal forces and political forces. So there's a very strange marriage between and very strange connection between these things. And so I think it's a challenge for us social scientists to really understand now in the moving of these things, what's going on and how to classify and how to understand what kind of state has been built by Bolsonaro and his group. But I don't think it's ultra-liberal, and I don't think it's proto-fascist. I think it has to do with something else, which we don't have really categories of analysis still to really understand, fully understand. And this is my limitation, at least. I think it's not enough. I think we need to start speaking about really, as Barry Gills pointed out so nicely in his opening words. I think we need to really speak about ecocide, genocide, ethnocide, because this is what's going on really on the ground here. Ethnocide and ecocide. These are the categories that we need to put in place, really to speak about the killing of people and killing of natural processes. I was very critical about the way Lula administration dealt with environmental issues and indigenous issues. Of course, as a neo-developmentalist, he gave little attention. He opened up little room for the idea of social environmental justice to compose with his left. He comes from a leftist, how do you say, factory ground experience, and indigenous issues were just would come as a part of the discourse, but not really the understanding that Brazil is a multiple ethnic society, and it should be considered fully, as I said. So I hope, it's just a hope that perhaps the left, the traditional left, the Workers' Party or the traditional left, would find a way out of this and would find ways, after all, to incorporate things which are dear to us all here, the environment, the environment and indigenous people's rights, and so on. So it's just a hope. I don't really know if they will have a full understanding of this. Lula has a tradition of being it's a he's a person that really negotiates with everybody. You know? He's a, how do you say, he composes he wants to be this guy that is in the middle and that he will serve everybody. And this is, we know that it didn't happen once or twice, not even with him, not with Dilma. And we don't know if there is a space for this review. I doubt it. That's what I say. I doubt it. But it's a struggle. It's a struggle that will go on. And I think that there's a much larger, stronger debate in Brazil. It's how do we really bring these issues to the regular people, to the common person, to the middle class? How do we involve middle class Brazilians? We are really now facing the fact that we do have more racism than we thought that we had. We are more racist, a racist society than we thought that we had, because the Brazilian tradition was always, tradition of thinking was always that of a racial democracy. No? Brazil is a racial democracy. Brazil is a place of mixture of races. But we are suddenly, since 5-6 years, we are debating how fraught this is, because we do have racism a lot, segregation. We do kill Black people a lot every day. It's in a huge rate in the cities. Young Black men are dying in numbers, large numbers every day in the cities of Brazil. So besides conflict with indigenous peoples in the forest and in the countryside, we do have urban problems with racism and segregation in the country. So we are learning how to deal with such issues nowadays in Brazil, and to really build up new ways of analyzing and thinking about all this. I don't know if I answered your question, but what I'm trying to say is that I can only say, as an activist, I don't see much space in the PT for really radical incorporation of what's going on with indigenous. Perhaps it will do somehow. It will do somehow, but not fully, because they still think and open up the frontier to commodities. This is the major issue here. Mining companies, they dominate. They really have I know there are a few words, but I just need to say that it's amazing how mining corporations dominate institutions in Brazil. Juridical institutions like the courts, the judges, and the public ministry, Ministério Público, the public ministry. And I'm really a pessimist. I'm not a very good person because I'm working within the disaster, the Mariana disaster and the Rio Doce disaster, and we have been dealing with this for 6 years. 6 years. And it's really sad what's going on, that people are not really resettled and compensated, and really disaster reparation is really another disaster. It's a disaster within the disaster, the system of reparation of this disaster. So I work with the local people. I'm very, very positive about the ways they are trying to build up resistance. But when I see it in a horizontal way, small initiatives in a horizontal way, I mean, in the territories, but I don't see how it can really get through the system of dominance of extractivism, for instance, in the country. Extractivism is dominating the political scene and juridical scene and all the institutions in the country. So it's very, very, we are going through a very, very moment of impasse here in Brazil. it's not only Bolsonaro. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not only Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is the head, of course, and he's leading, he's really giving permission for these other conservative forces to really show up. That's what I'm trying to say. But in Minas Gerais, we have a governor much worse than Bolsonaro, Zema. Zema is terrible. He has done things way, way ahead of Bolsonaro here in Minas Gerais. And thus we have other governors in Brazil acting the same way. So how do we manage with all these political conservative forces spread in the country? This is an issue that we need to deal with.
Thank you, Andrea. So there's two questions about this issue of participation. This one related to the one you talked about. So Dominika Glogovsky asks, in your last slide, you showcased workshops with survivors of Mariana. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that, and if you conduct workshops, for example, empowering workshops with victims, or how you approach the topic with communities. And related to that, Saila Maria Saaristo also asks that I was wondering how you see the role of structures of participatory democracy that have existed in Brazil, at least before their heavy dismantling in the recent years. Could they and how be restructured to promote substantial participation instead of contributing to slow violence?
Oh, thank you. These are very difficult questions, very difficult questions. I really don't know the last one about how we can really see the political forces contributing to major changes. This is really open. We are living in a I must say something to place. We are still under a pandemic. For example, I'm still working in home office till now. Yeah? Many people are still in home office. So we have had some protests in the streets along the year, many parts of the year. But with time, it becomes really something less strong than it was like 1 year ago, or like the beginning of the year. People get tired of moving, of trying to get out of the houses in order to protest, and things really don't really change. The Congress in Brazil is completely dominated by conservative forces like the agribusiness and mining lobbies in the Congress. So there's a major. It's not only changes in the executive, in the government, not changes only in the government, but we need to change also politicians in the houses, in the parliament, and this is the biggest challenge we have. How we change these politicians. We have a terrible Congress, terrible parliament, terrible. The worst in Brazil was never good with the parliamentary, but this is the worst ever. No? So what makes us very pessimistic about changes here, and or at least shows how difficult it is to do that. So I try to concentrate my work with the local people, and I do carry these workshops with the people affected by the dams in Mariana and other places, especially in Mariana, because this is one way of trying to really collaborate with their I don't like the word empowerment, but that the way they really don't serve much justice to these people. So what we have done some experiences we did a lot over the 6 years. So the disaster is a process. So we have done things like in the beginning of the disaster, in the first 2-3 years, we've done some what we called some participative mapping with the community, so they would really realize what kind of losses and what kind of damage they really suffered, and they could collect these and organize this themselves in order to confront the metrics of damage, let's say, what they have lost, with the idea that companies present to them about their losses. There's a huge difference between what they understand they have lost within the disaster and what the companies really are willing to pay to recognize as their loss, and they are really willing to pay for this. So it's a struggle. It's a struggle that involves their confrontation with the corporations, but also their confrontation with the agents of justice in Brazil, and judges and other justice representatives, institutional representatives. They are not very open to understand or to discuss to open to the views of the local people. They always tend to accept what companies present as their assessment of laws and things like that. So as a university professor and group of researchers, we try to add some kind of technical capital for them. So they recruit us when they need us, when they ask our advice. So we try to work in collaboration with them. And we have produced this some materials, which is, for example, this is the map, the kind of thing I'm talking about, the cartography of Paracatu, which is a community totally destroyed by the Samarco Dam. And we have worked with the local people in this mapping of their community and their problems, what was lost and what was. And this is a project that they really use in their confrontation with the companies. And I just forgot what the first question was. About Mariana this is the experience we have been working with local people still, and it's a long run commitment, very sad commitment. Many people have died along the way, along the years. People get sick, they get ill, they get depressed, they get into medication. Some people in the countryside, which they were not removed to the city, but they remained there in other places. They have lost their animals, for example, their cattle, it's difficult for them to keep going in their activities in the rural area because they are living in rented lands, rented houses. They don't have enough space to keep their cattle or their little, animals, the things they need to survive. It's really depressing. I'm not perhaps in a good mood to speak about, because it's really, really difficult for us researchers to really attend this daily and to see very little moving on in this. People very powerless and no institution, nothing to help them out. It's very sad. Sorry, it's very sad.
Thanks, Andrea. We have some 7 minutes left, so if there are some urgent last questions, comments, please use the chat. There are some nice links in the chat and some responses to some prior questions. So maybe I could ask, so how do you see what could be the foreign actions in this dire situation of Brazil today? Is there something that actors outside of Brazil could do to
Yeah, I think it's very important. Connections and pressure from outside. I think this is a big hope. Yeah. For example, last week, stepping out from the mining context, but the beer company Heineken from Holland, Heineken beer, you know, they tried to build a factory nearby where we have the oldest archaeological site in the Americas. It's near here, Belo Horizonte. It's a site where they found Luzia, the oldest skeleton, how do you say, the old remains of a human being of the Americas. So it's very important. And the governor of Minas Gerais just granted the license for Heineken to start the factory very near this very important archaeological site. And what happened now that we stopped the company? I mean, there was a resistance from part of the archaeologists and social movements around this area. And of course, small businessmen from this town is very welcoming Heineken to be installed. And what we're trying to suggest to the people is that we connect people in Holland, NGOs in Holland, to make pressure over Heineken not to be installed in this exactly site, that the company move to some other place, not here. They don't need to destroy the oldest archaeological site in the Americas in order to produce beer. There are other places where they can produce beer here. Of course, this is not the same case as in mining. This is the major argument here, that iron ore, gold, you cannot move to another site in order to install your operations. Then the argument is that you have a fixed site for mining. And what I'm trying to say here is that under the circumstances in Brazil, and that the companies have this major impact on governments here in all levels, that perhaps international pressure, this has been most important now. As I said in my talk, it reminds me of the 1980s and 1990s, when the international pressure over operations in the Brazilian Amazon really helped to curb deforestation, and really. So I think that, I think the international community, NGOs, researchers, and networks would do a great job in trying to make pressure over their companies located in their countries, which I know that extractivism is a spread. I mean, it's in the financial market, but there are instances where I think different countries can act in order to really bring this debate over, and for European consumers, European companies, European governments make pressure over the European Union, so to really bring the situation of local peoples here in Latin America and in Brazil in particular. I know that there is, in the case of the disaster, the disaster of Mariana, BHP Billington is involved in this disaster, BHP Billington, and there is a court case going on in London at the moment, and people have a lot of hope that this court case would result in something positive, the acknowledgement of the rights, the violation of rights of these people, and more than the courts in Brazil. So there's a huge expectation for that. So yeah, I think this kind of networking, international activist pressure would perhaps result in some collaboration for local governments and the federal government of Brazil to really respect the rights of local people. And I do believe also that we can criticize initiatives around responsible mining and the sustainable dams and new Green Deal, Green New Deals initiatives, which these kind of initiatives, I believe, and most social movements believe here, they really don't help much to get justice at the end, environmental justice at the end.
Great, thank you for the wonderful presentation, Andrea, and taking the time to wake up so early, and nice to hear all those news from Brazil and so on, and for sharing your time and preparing this wonderful presentation. So maybe